Just a minute. Okay, so Moreh Nevukhim, chapter 50 for today. The title that we have for our chapter is called The Difference Between Real Knowledge and Lip Service. And let us get our bearings as to where we are at this point in the Sefer, in the work. We had concluded chapter 49 last week with the discussion of the angels and their non-corporeal nature. And this sort of is the finishing of a whole set of discussions that the Rambam had up until now about how completely spiritual, metaphysical beings are non-corporeal, do not have any physical form. This was very important for the Rambam to lay out in his discussion about God, and first and foremost. And the 49th chapter was really just incidental to that, was that now I've discussed God, let me also discuss something else that's non-corporeal, which are his angels. We are now ready to begin sort of like a new subject that is related to God, and that is in our further refining about how a Jew is supposed to think about God. The Rambam is about to discuss the other attributes which we use in our language to describe God. God is benevolent, God is merciful, God is all-knowing, God is all-powerful, and so forth and so on. All of the attributes that we find that are given to God in Tanakh are really a compromise of language. And what do we mean by that? Is that the Rambam is going to be laying out for us that in order for us to truly have a proper understanding of God, we are going to have to reconcile our belief in God's unity, which is the most important feature, apparently, about God that is emphasized in the Tanakh. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. And the apparent multiplicity or diversity that exists within God as a result of his multiple attributes. And the Rambam will set out to sort of set us straight in making sure that we understand that when we ascribe attributes to God, he is this, he is that, those attributes are unlike the attributes of any other existent being. A person may be wise, may be strong, may have capabilities, but those attributes are not intrinsic to that being the way that God's attributes are intrinsic to him. In other words, there is nothing separable or changeable at all about God. And that's going to be a subject that we're going to spend a lot of time on. But as an introduction to that subject, the Rambam wants to make sure that we understand the shortcomings of language. And this is a very, very deep discussion philosophically about how we acquire knowledge and what language says about the knowledge that we possess. Rav Toledano has a very interesting discussion in his commentary to Moreh Nevukhim at this point, where he brings in more modern philosophers who discuss the philosophy of language. You know, in the modern period of philosophy, there's this concept that really language defines our thinking. Is that and that's why you have different attitudes and different modes of thinking when you cross over different cultures and different languages, because every language brings with it a different way of thinking. And to a certain degree, that's true. Everyone must agree with that I think as an English speaker, whereas another person may think as a Hebrew speaker, and that creates there's not only a cultural divide because of our upbringing, but also because of the language that we speak. But there's another deeper question, and that is, are there thoughts that a human being is capable of having that go beyond the language? Meaning, is it possible that there's something that I can conceive of that is so otherworldly or so transcends beyond my plane of existence that it's impossible for me to formulate that idea into words? As articulate as I may be, it is still not possible for me to put those concepts into words by nature of their otherworldliness. Now, the Rambam subscribes to a particular kind of epistemology, that word that we've used before to describe the study of how a person cognizes or how a person knows things. And this is a very central theme of the Moreh Nevukhim, to sort of try and identify how a person acquires ideas. When we get into the Renaissance era, we know that there is this huge debate between the empiricists and the rationalists in describing how a person acquires knowledge. The empirical school is a group of philosophers who believe that the only way that knowledge comes into a person's mind is through one's external senses. Whatever I experience, whether through seeing, hearing, touching, and so forth, that is my method of acquisition of knowledge. And everyone agrees with that. But the question is that the sole method of acquiring knowledge? If you follow the rationalists like Descartes, who lives much later than the Rambam, but puts this idea into the forefront of his philosophy, his suggestion is that there are certain things called a priori knowledge, or things that can exist in a person's mind prior to acquiring any information from the outside world. I actually have copied for you in the handout today an encyclopedia entry about Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, the great Islamic philosopher of the 10th and 11th centuries, who had a profound influence on the Rambam's thought. He too was able to take both Aristotelian and Neoplatonic philosophy and combine it together. And one of the major theories of Avicenna was his epistemological model of how people acquire knowledge. And he believed that it is possible for people to attain knowledge of things that are completely outside their realm of experience, completely outside this time-space existence in which we are confined. Let me just point out that, Pines, in his translation, when he would ever discuss the idea of a person acquiring knowledge, he would say that it's possible for a person to apprehend something. And I believe that word is very, very deliberate. There's a phrase in the Torah, Veha Adam yada et Chava ishto, that Adam knew his wife Chava, his wife Eve, at the very beginning of chapter 4 of the book of Genesis. And we see that idea of yada, to know, being used for carnal knowledge. What that means is that when a man and a woman have intimacy, the verb that is used to describe that intimacy between a man and a woman is known as da'at, is known as knowledge. What is the connection between those two? The theory of this, behind this idea, is that knowledge is an attachment to the object of that which I seek to know. It is not that a person pulls in ideas into their head from an outside source, let's say from their senses, and is able to cognize that way, but rather a person's mind actually attaches itself and conjoins itself and apprehends those things which are completely transcendent beyond that which is immediately outside of within my environment. And that's the idea that the Rambam wants us to know. And ultimately, the Rambam is going to conclude that indeed it is possible and it is necessary that the human experience allows for the cognition of things that are not even translatable into language, because so lofty are they. Language has its limitations, and therefore there are certain ideas that even transcend language. When it comes to God, a proper understanding of God actually transcends language, so that we can say certain things about God, but we cannot do the knowledge that we have about God justice because language fails us. Okay, I don't want to harp too much on this. I've taken up already enough time. But that's, I think, a necessary introduction for us to understand what he's about to tell us. And essentially the whole idea of this chapter is that it's one thing to affirm something verbally. It's another thing to actually cognize what you are affirming. So for example, a very simple sentence, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, that we teach our children when they're barely able to speak, and we want them to be able to understand that this is a concept that is very dear to us about a central theme of Judaism. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. It is very easy to say that, but it is much more difficult to actually cognize what that concept really means. And it actually, when we try to break down what it really means, we will discover that our language fails us. Okay. Know thou. Now, I want you to know, this, you person who are reading the Moreh Nevukhim, says the Rambam at the opening of chapter 50, that belief is not the notion that is uttered, but the notion that is represented in the soul when it has been averred of it, that it is in fact just as it has been represented. Just because you can say something does not mean that you have true knowledge of it or belief of it, which is the term that the Rambam uses. Just because you can say something doesn't mean you automatically believe it. And the Rambam may be writing somewhat polemically, because in Islam, a lot of emphasis is placed upon making faith affirmations about Allah and about Muhammad, his prophet. And the Rambam may feel that while there's such an emphasis placed upon that in other religions about faith affirmations, but in Judaism, faith affirmations are not the most important thing. It is knowledge, it is faith knowledge or faith belief that is much more important than verbal affirmations. If you belong to those who are satisfied with expressing in speech the opinions that are correct or that you deem to be correct, without representing them to yourself and believing them, and still less without seeking certain knowledge regarding them, you take a very easy road. You're taking the simple path, you're taking shortcuts, you're being lazy, essentially is what the Rambam is saying. Just because you can say something that we believe in Judaism, and you don't spend the time trying to figure out what it really means, and really believing it in the core of your being, then you're not really doing the right thing. In accordance with this, you will find many stupid people holding to beliefs to which, in their representation, they do not attach any meaning whatsoever. People will say, I believe something, when they really don't believe it, but they just think they believe it because they're able to say it in terms of language, but they've never taken the time to actually think about why they believe in what they say they believe in. If, however, you belong to those whose aspirations are directed towards ascending to that high rank, which is the rank of speculation or iyun, if you really are interested in thinking about the things that you ought to know or the things that you ought to believe, and to gaining certain knowledge with regard to God's being one by virtue of a true oneness, so that no composition whatsoever is to be found in him. God is not comprised of composites. He is not made up of different components, is essentially what he means. And if you're really committed to that idea of trying to cogitate on that, to really contemplate it and really affirm it within yourself, and that there's no possibility of division within him in any way whatsoever, then you must know that he, may he be exalted, has in no way and in no mode any essential attribute, and that just as it is impossible that he should be a body, it is also impossible that he should possess any essential attribute. The term that Pines uses, to'ar atzmi, that God has no essential or intrinsic attributes. God, the greatest simplicity is just being, not a being that is X or that is Y. Once you attach an attribute of God, you are starting to divide God up into greater than a simple unity. And that's really the Rambam's thesis. It is based upon his Islamic philosophical forebears, and it's going to be necessary for us to spend several chapters unpacking this idea that God does not have any essential attributes. If, however, someone believes that he is one, but possesses a certain number of essential attributes, he says in his words that he is one, but believes him in his thought to be many. And essentially, you can't, you're sort of, it's an impossible thing to maintain both beliefs. You cannot believe that God is unitary and believe that he has essential attributes at the same time. And by trying to balance those or juggle those together, essentially you realize that you don't really know anything about God if you can try to maintain both of those beliefs. This resembles what the Christians say, namely that he is one but also three, and that the three are one. And the Rambam is giving a little dig at Christian theology, which tries to reconcile a trinity with unity. Ultimately, the Rambam says it's impossible. If God is unitary, he can't be trinitary. If he is trinitary, he can't be unitary. And if you try to convince yourself that God has multiple attributes, that he is Tiferes, and that he's Gevura, and that he's all of these different things, then you are denying God's unitary nature, and it's impossible to reconcile the two. Now, you may say, well, what does the Rambam mean? The entire Zohar, all of Kabbalah, is based upon breaking God down into multiple different Godheads or into multiple different emanations or manifestations of God. The Rambam will tell you, either the Rambam will reject Kabbalah entirely, which is an interesting discussion, not for now, or the Rambam will tell you that you really don't understand these Kabbalistic teachings. These are manifestations of God, but do not in any way describe God's essential nature. Similar to this is the assertion of him who says that he is one, but possesses many attributes, and that he and his attributes are one, while he denies at the same time his being corporeal and believes in his absolute simplicity. In other words, again, it's irreconcilable, just like a trinity is irreconcilable to unity, as if what we aimed at and investigated were what we should say and not what we should believe. In other words, if you think that as long as you verbalize something that's tantamount to believing it, then you're making a tremendous mistake. Just because you say something doesn't mean it's affirmed within your mind. And essentially, your language is not the same as your knowledge or of your belief. For there is no belief except after a representation. What he really means to say, using a slightly different way of formulating these words, you can only believe something after it is embedded within your mind properly, not just because you said it on your lips. Your verbalization of something does not create a full belief of that in your mind. Our hope is that when we affirm things eventually, v'hashevota el livavecha, that it'll become part of our belief system, but it's not automatic. Belief is the affirmation that what has been represented is outside the mind, just as it has been represented in the mind. True belief is your certainty that what you are thinking is actually the external reality, is actually the ontological reality. So that's what true knowledge is. That when you have a certainty that the idea that is in your mind is an accurate representation of that which is outside your mind. If together with this belief one realizes that a belief different from it is in no way possible, and that no starting point can be found in the mind for a rejection of this belief, or for the supposition that a different belief is possible, there is certainty. The Rambam has defined certainty as being an understanding that the idea that I have about this idea is true, and that no other alternative to this idea is possible about that particular thing that I am thinking of. Then I have certainty. And the Rambam now says you're going to need three things to reach a level of what he calls certainty. What are those three things? When you shall have cast off desires and habits. Number one, you have to get rid of your physical drives, your physical desires, and your physical habits, meaning put away your preconceived notions of how you previously thought about things. You're going to have to put all of that behind you if you're going to have a more mature and sophisticated understanding of God. That's requirement number one. Requirement number two, you will have been endowed with understanding. You're going to have to develop your intellect. And that's an exercise because the intellect is a muscle just like any other muscle in the body. And finally, number three, you shall reflect on what I shall say in the following chapters, which shall treat of the negation of attributes you shall necessarily achieve certain knowledge of it. So if you go through these three prerequisite steps, number one, put aside your preconceived notions and your desires. Number two, exercise your mind properly. And number three, really focus on what I'm going to tell you in the next several chapters. Then you will arrive at what I just defined as what is certainty. You will have a certainty of knowledge about God. And that certainty of knowledge about God will make you conclude that God is devoid of any intrinsic attributes. What he's going to say are those things, the way that we describe God with our language is really not the conclusion that you will have in your mind about what God really is. Okay, then you shall be one of those who represent to themselves the unity of the name, and not one of those who merely proclaim it with their mouth without representing to themselves that it has a meaning. Once you get to that level, you will be in the inner sanctum. You will be one of those few people who, when he says, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, you will really understand what it truly means, and not just be giving lip service to that affirmation. With regard to men of this category, meaning regarding to those people who do not properly grasp unity, it is said, thou art near in their mouth and far from their reins. What the Rambam is referring to is a pasuk in Yirmiyahu, and in Jeremiah chapter 12, the prophet at the beginning of that chapter is really talking about evil people. He's talking about bad people. And the first verse of that chapter asks a question. He says, Madua derech rishaim tzalecha. Why is it that the evil prosper, shalu kol bogdei vaged, and that those who rebel against you seem to have a sense of well-being? And you notice that many times the prophet asks the question without answering the question, why is it that good things happen to bad people? That's really the question. The verse immediately after that is what the Rambam is quoting over here. Nitatam gam shorashu, yelchu gam asu peri, that they plant and things take root. They are able to grow produce and see tremendous blessing in whatever they do. Karov ata befihem v'rachok mikilyotehem, that you are near to them in their mouths, but you are very distant from their kilyot, from their kidneys. What the word kidneys in Tanakh means a person's inner thoughts, because we know the idea that the klayot yoatzot, that the kidneys are the counsel of man. Why the kidney is chosen is unclear at this point, but the point being is that the prophet is talking about people who pay lip service, that they talk about God verbally, but they don't really have it in mind at all. And the Rambam is using this verse not to describe an evil person, but to describe an ignorant person, a person who may profess to be a believer in God, but truly does not believe in God in the way that he ought to, simply because he has not been able to exercise his intellect properly enough to realize that when I affirm that God is one, I need to really understand what that unity means. And if you don't properly apply yourself and apply your intellect, you'll never really have a good understanding of what unity is. But men ought rather to belong to the category of those who represent the truth to themselves and apprehend it, even if they do not utter it, right? So the Rambam says it would be better to belong to that category of people who know the truth and have proper beliefs, even when they don't talk about it. There are a lot of people who talk the talk but don't walk the walk. Rambam says better that you walk the walk and don't talk the talk. And as the virtuous are commanded to do, for they are told, and here he quotes the pasuk from Tehillim chapter 4, from Psalms chapter 4, which says, Imru v'vilvavchem al mishkavchem, speak to your hearts only, and not verbalize things outside when you go to bed, v'domu sela, and be still forever. And sometimes silence is much preferable to a wise person than a lot of verbiage, because verbiage really is not indicative, as the Rambam has. This whole point of this chapter is your verbalization of faith affirmations in no way is indicative of what you truly believe in your heart of hearts. And when it comes to theological and philosophical affirmations about God, you cannot gauge what a person truly believes by what comes out of their mouth. And the Rambam says, I am here to help you. I am here to actually help you acquire a proper intellectual understanding of God and the most important feature of God that is described in Tanakh, which is his unity. But you got to work on it. We're going to have to work together on this over the next ensuing chapters. And the most difficult thing for us to be able to do is to acquire an understanding of God that transcends even our ability to describe God. Ultimately, the Rambam's conclusion will be that a true knowledge of God is not something that can be formulated into proper verbiage, because our words, our vocabulary, is limited to a time-space confinement, because God transcends time, space, and anything within our frame of reference. Therefore, even his unity is something that cannot be communicated verbally in a correct form, which is why God can only be represented metaphorically in Tanakh and cannot be represented accurately as he truly is, because the human mind cannot formulate that into proper verbiage to be found in Tanakh. But the Rambam's thesis is nonetheless that even though I can't verbalize it, I can in some way gain some level of understanding of God's essence. Not that I'll be ever be able to attain a full and true knowledge of God in his truest of essences, but the human mind is at least capable of grasping this idea of unity. And that's what we're going to be working on over the next several chapters. One should also bear in mind that the Rambam's opinion on this matter, that one is capable of grasping God's unity properly, is not necessarily agreed to by his contemporaries. There are those who are going to resign themselves to the idea that the idea of unity as it comes to God is something that we can vaguely describe but never truly understand, and it would probably be best if we desist from this exercise. And yet, there is a whole school of philosophy, the Rambam includes himself in that category, which says that it is important to understand what unity truly means. Even if you'll never be able to put it into words, at least we'll be able to direct you to properly think about God in the way that you're supposed to. Another example of great philosophical thinkers of this time is Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Pakuda in the Chovot HaLevavot, where he devotes an entire chapter to Yichud. Shar HaYichud, the gate of unity, is a long philosophical explication of this idea that the Rambam is going to present to us in the Moreh Nevukhim. Quite interesting that those of us who study Chovot HaLevavot have been instructed by great rabbinical masters like the Vilna Gaon to skip that chapter, because there is an attitude in later generations that this may not be a fully productive exercise, and at the end of this endeavor we may not be as enhanced as we were told that we would be through this exercise, and sometimes it's better to desist from a losing proposition instead of getting so entangled with it that we are left confused and frustrated. And yet, that's not the approach of the Moreh Nevukhim, and that's why we're going to soldier on over the next several chapters. Have a great day and a great week.